All right, everyone, if you can make your way back to your seats, we're going to get started.
Oh, do I have and do they work?
They do work.
So you gotta turn it on. Testing.
It takes just like a couple seconds, and then it will go.
Should they test their mics?
See, now it's not.
Testing, testing.
So once you turn it on, it just takes a second to connect wirelessly.
Hello? Hello? I think there's some trick about...
Test, test. Yeah, this is good too.
You guys good? We are thrilled to introduce our keynote fireside conversation on corporate power and justice. It is our honor to welcome to the stage our speakers, Professor Michael Fakhri from the University of Oregon School of Law and UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Leilani Farha, Global Director of The Shift, an international human rights organization focused on housing, finance, and climate, and former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, and our faculty advisor for this symposium, Professor Dhir from the University of Connecticut School of Law. As a reminder, you can find full bios for these speakers and all of our speakers in the web program, and we'll be doing Slido at the end for our questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Hannah mentioned, I'm Professor Dhir. I've been here at UConn Law since 2022, and I work and teach in the fields of corporate law and corporate governance. Earlier this week, I taught my very first corporate law class of the semester. I know I have some of my students here. And, you know, I mentioned in class, as I do every year, that I very much come to the view that understanding how the business corporation works is so essential, not just for those of us who go on to pursue careers in corporate law, but also for those of us who go on to pursue careers that involve challenging the apparatus of power. And so with that in mind, the theme of today's keynote conversation is corporate power and justice. And I can't think of two people who are better suited to address this topic with us than Leilani Farha and Michael Fakhri. I have had the privilege of knowing both Leilani and Michael for many, many years, and in the privacy of my own mind, it has been a goal of mine, a dream of mine, frankly, to bring them into conversation with one another. So, to just set the table a little bit, for those who might not be familiar with the UN system, special rapporteurs are independent experts who are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. They essentially have the responsibility of monitoring, advising, and reporting on human rights issues. I attended a brilliant lecture by Michael last night, and I believe you referred to special rapporteurs as the eyes, ears, and the sometimes good conscience of the UN human rights system. So for Leilani, that has involved the right to adequate housing, which the UN has underscored involves the right to live in security, in peace, in dignity. And for Michael, that has involved the right to food, which the UN has underscores involves the right to have regular, permanent, unrestricted access to adequate food. Now, in thinking about those two rights, it may not be immediately obvious to us how there's this core corporate component. But in watching Leilani and Michael's work through the years from afar, I have been consistently struck by the fact that corporate power is a constant presence. Sometimes in the background, and sometimes front and center. As Leilani wrote in a 2019 report to the UN Human Rights Council, many actors involved in housing operate at the transnational level and deal with complex corporate structures that pose considerable obstacles to accountability. And for my BizOrg students, those are the kinds of corporate structures that we learn about together in BizOrg. And as Michael wrote in a 2021 report to the UN General Assembly, to ensure the full realization of human rights, the validity of the corporate form itself must be interrogated. Okay, so with that overall context, yeah, I know. You wrote that. You wrote that. I didn't make that up. So with that overall, well, you know, Michael knows this. He met my 8-year-old the other day, and I was telling him a story about how she accuses me at bedtime of not reading with enough expression. So I've been really trying to up my expression game. All right, so with that context in mind, let's jump in. Leilani, I'd like to begin with you. When we think about the right to housing globally, one of the key challenges in realizing this right is the financialization of housing. Increasingly, we see business actors profiting from housing, which in turn then furthers the problem of access. So for our audience, could you start, please, by setting out the nature of this problem, the extent of the problem, and then let's name some names, who the key actors are.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. And before I answer that 3-part question, I just want to say it's a distinct pleasure to be here for many reasons, which I won't enumerate, but for many, many reasons. Really, really special moment for me. I also want to say I am a human rights lawyer. I do not come to this business stuff, the corporation stuff, willingly. No. I was dragged here. I was dragged here because one of my UN assistants, when I was Rapporteur, said to me, let's do a report where we follow the money. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool, follow the money. I've seen that in movies, let's follow the money. We followed the money, and that was in 2017, and I've been stuck in this corporate world ever since, and it is a very important world to understand and try to navigate, especially if you care about human rights. Okay, so the problem. Well, from my vantage, the problem is that corporate actors and funds entered a sector that is a human right, and instead of getting to know what that human right means and requires of them, they launched a frontal attack on the right to housing through their business model, attacking the fundamentals of what the right to housing means and is. Things like attacking security of tenure, attacking affordability, attacking habitability, and attacking the meaningful participation of tenants and dwellers in the housing process. Okay, so that's the zoomed out problem. Now, I thought it would be useful before I talk about their business model, which is really the heart of the problem. Who am I talking about? Which actors? You've already been talking about them today. It's the other black, though, more than the black rock you were all talking about. They are involved, private equity, but Blackstone is one of the most aggressive actors in the space. They control about $1 trillion worth of real estate assets, a huge proportion of which would be residential real estate assets, so apartments and single-family homes. Pension funds are very much in the mix. Asset management firms, insurance companies, real estate investment trusts are a vehicle and a sort of entity that they use. So they are the actors with private equity, and there are also, of course, housing developers, those folks. Private equity is by far the most predatory. So what's the business model? It's pretty simple. Buy cheap, sell high. That's what they do. There's a way in which they do that, and there is so much harm from what they do from a human rights point of view. So first of all, they have to find the assets. So they use AI, they have access to technology that enables them to see what's coming to market or could come to market or could be preyed upon to come to market, and they use that to their benefit. They are always targeting, remember, it's buy cheap, sell high, so they're always targeting what we might call, using a general term, affordable housing. So what they're looking at are like distressed assets, homes that have foreclosed, you're all familiar with that from '08, but also just that old apartment building down the road that was built in the 60s and where tenants have lived for 10 years, 20 years, and they're still paying an affordable rent. Those are prime locations. In this country, it's racialized communities that have been mostly affected, particularly in the Sun Belt region. So once they buy, what do? They have a very intact, I should say, when they buy, they use the least amount of their own money that they can, or their investors' money. So they are availing themselves of bank loans, of public monies, for however they can get them through public programs, because that increases their profitability, right, if they're not using their own money. So then they invariably engage in some kind of activity. It can go in two different directions, mostly cosmetic upgrades to make the place look a little nicer, and an immediate increase in all fees. Fob key, increase in fee. Laundry machines, increase in fee. Parking, increase in fee. Default, you fail to pay your rent on time, a big fee. Interest on the fee. That's total, modus operandi. They also engage in much more predatory behavior, like using weak tenant legislation to evict people and raise rents, raising rents as much as they can. That will increase their revenues, obviously, as will the fees. They will also do things to reduce their expenses, right? So that increases the return on investment. So they're getting rid of the second janitor. They're not doing maintenance as much as they used to in common spaces, not hiring cleaning companies. You get the picture. In some cases, what they will do with a really old building is they will let it completely crumble, fall into complete disrepair. Why? Because then they have a great argument that they can raise the thing and rebuild and reposition to luxury or higher end units. That's, I've done that's painting with a really broad brush. The name of the game, you might think, oh yeah, they're increasing the rent and that means, better returns for shareholders. That's part of it, but a big part of this is getting the property valuation higher. That enables them to, for example, renegotiate loans and get better interest rate loans once they've repositioned the property. That's how banks operate, right? And that then will increase their profitability, whether they sell or whether they continue to just operate and run monies to shareholders. So the refinancing is a really big part of this, or selling once they've done all of these changes, and they sell for, it's exponential growth we're talking about. So I'm going to talk about the extent, and I will say there's a lot of contestation around the extent. So you'll see the Atlantic, for example, article after article indicating that this is just a small percentage of the actual housing, that they only own a small percentage. The lowest amount that they own in the in this country in the single-family sector is about 20%. Where we're talking about apartment buildings, especially buildings with more than 100 units, it's way up at 65% or something like that, corporate ownership. But I want to say this, which is the harms are so severe, with the right to housing being absolutely integrally related to the right to life. The harm is so severe, to me, 20% is alarming. 65% is extremely alarming. So I don't actually like to quibble about how much they do or don't own. We do know that it is increased, the investor class in housing is increasing. It's enough for me, the human rights harms are enough for me to be concerned. And the other thing I want to say on extent, Erin, is it's not just, I've mentioned single family homes, apartment buildings, but it's much broader than that. In this country, one of the most affordable places to live is a mobile home. They are snatching up the land on which mobile homes are situated. Student housing is one of the hottest asset classes. Greystar, right here in Connecticut, Greystar is putting up and converting buildings into student housing and charging exorbitant rates, making it impossible for students to both pay tuition and pay the rent. Old age home, care homes being bought up by private equity. So the extent is not just in the number, but it's the saturation of the different types of homes. And I'm about to stop, but I just want to underscore some of the harms that you might not consider. I mean, there's the obvious thing, housing is precious, right, to human security, right? We all know that. We know that when times are really tough, home is that retreat, right? It's a place of safety often, not always. I don't want to put, I don't have rose-colored glasses here. I know home can be the site of violence too, and discrimination and all sorts of awful things. But let's say home is really central to health and well-being. We know that. And we know that these practices are harming tenants. I've met many people living in their cars, in recreational vehicles, in tents, in parks, under bridges in this country, as well as in my own country in Canada. And all of those people were housed at one point, yeah? And many of them were housed in apartments that they got priced out of and are now living in tremendous insecurity. The life expectancy of someone who's homeless is 50% lower than for someone else who is housed. So that's, like, those harms, the fear, are they gonna raise my rent? I've talked to many families, terrified. If they raise my rent, there's nowhere in this community I can afford. Where will I go? The fear is real. Kids are going to school. They'll lose their friendships. They'll lose social contact with other family members. So there's that whole layer of harm to tenants and dwellers. But I want to say the harm is bigger than that and goes much further. First of all, they're controlling markets. These actors help to set the housing costs across communities. As they push upward, it means the whole sector gets pushed upward in terms of unaffordability. I also want to say that even if they only represent 20 or 60 or whatever percentage of the market, they influence, they set the business model. They are the business model. So you're a small potatoes landlord and you're looking, well, if Blackstone can do it, why can't I? They've created a model. And lastly, they have an outsized influence with government. 100% for sure. They have a seat at the table. They are advising governments. What happened when the pandemic struck? Who went around to government after government giving advice? BlackRock. They were hired by governments around the world to give them advice. Obviously, they're going to give them advice that benefits them. They're pouring money into anti-rent control propositions in California, for example. So the harm is really spread broad. And so it goes beyond the idea of just affecting access to housing.
All right, that's fabulous. That gives us a really, really helpful sense of the nature and extent of the problem. So with that in mind, I want to put this problem in historical context. Can you give us a sense of how we actually got here and how housing policy changed with the overall turn to neoliberalism?
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism is the turn that allowed for this. I call the era we're in now financialized neoliberalism. And I guess if I could really distill it, to me what happened when neoliberalism came in was a shift in particular by governments away from everyday people, the public, toward fiduciary duties and financial actors. And people have disappeared now from the equation, and the real emphasis of governments, and of course these actors, is on shareholder return, basically. How did it happen? I mean, with neoliberalism, I mean, I think everyone in the room will know what neoliberalism meant. It meant governments took a really big step back from the public, from social services. They started selling off social housing, especially, or you call it public housing here. They started weakening tenant protections, and they pivoted and said, we are giving up our human right to housing obligations, and we're going to hand over housing to the private sector. And we're going to incentivize the private sector and those guys, and it's mostly guys, at the top. We're going to incentivize them, and maybe there will be some benefits to the people down, the majority down at the bottom. A failed experiment, we all know that. Trickle-down theories don't work. Even the IMF has said so. And yet, in the area of residential real estate, it persists on steroids, I would say. And so now the emphasis is, as I said, really not on human rights obligations, and instead is on what's called fiduciary duty. And I hope we have some conversation about how fiduciary duty is defined, because surely treating tenants well would be part of a fiduciary duty. Is that enough on neoliberalism?
Yeah, that's really nice. Thank you. So you've referenced the affordable housing space, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this, the specifics of that dynamic and who is affected.
Yeah, I want to just throw a stat out that I found recently, not for this presentation, for something else I was doing, but just so you understand, in the third quarter of 2023, investors purchased in this country 26% of the most affordable homes in the country. So they are going after affordable homes. And affordable can be defined in different ways. So in the US, you don't have a lot of public housing left. So in this country, affordable homes means mostly two things as I understand it. One, mobile homes, like I already mentioned, and it's really the lands that they're purchasing. They're not buying, people own their own mobile home, it's the land, right? They rent the land to put the mobile home on it. And so private equity, asset management, pension funds, et cetera, are going after those lands. And you also have a program in this country, it's a public program, it's actually not a bad program, where the government gives money to private actors to build or invest in what's considered affordable housing, and it really is affordable to many people, and it's for I think it's a 35-year contract. A lot of those contracts are coming to their end, and private equity, is Blackstone in particular, is moving in, buying up the buildings where those contracts are coming to an end, and then will flip those buildings to market rent. So for example, in San Diego, I think in 2021, Blackstone bought 6,000 1,000 of these affordable units, and now just Google San Diego affordable, Blackstone news, and you'll see what they're doing. And they said they weren't going to, and they are. They're flipping them to market rent. In other countries, they are actually in the social housing space. So there's a company in the UK called Sage, and Sage is like what I would call public or social housing, and Blackstone runs it, owns it, etc. I'm keeping my eye on that. I haven't seen too many public news stories about negative outcomes, but I was on a Reddit chat and I could see Sage tenants really complaining. So these are things we have to keep our eye on. They are absolutely moving in the affordable space. They're positioning themselves as the solution to the housing crisis in every city around the world.
Okay. I wanted to mention to our audience that just a few years ago, Leilani's work was featured in an award-winning documentary called Push. And basically that film, it follows Leilani as she investigates the question of why and how cities around the world are essentially becoming so unaffordable. And that film hits on a number of the notes that Leilani has just covered. And so with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, look, what has the industry response been to your work, to your critique? How have they engaged with your critique?
I love this question, and no one ever asks me this question, so thank you, Erin. Yeah, so, they tried to shut down the film. Blackstone did. In particular, they wrote letters to public broadcasters wherever the film had been sold and asked them not to air it, claiming that there were errors and lies perpetrated in the film, including by me. They failed. Not a single public broadcaster said, yeah, okay, we'll do what you want. Yeah. They have tended to come after me with what I would consider to be slightly ad hominem attacks, questioning my intelligence, that kind of thing. They have also questioned the veracity of some of the claims. When I was UN Rapporteur, there's a mechanism called a communications mechanism where you can write a kind of legal letter to any entity. It doesn't have to be just to a government. And so I wrote 6 or 7 communications, one to Blackstone and then to a bunch of states that had invited private equity in, including the US and Ireland and Spain, et cetera. And Blackstone responded by saying, there were inaccuracies and factual errors, which may or may not be true, but it's very difficult to investigate these guys because everything is, there's no transparency, let's put it that way. There is zero transparency. It's a little bit better when a company is public, like REITs tend to be public and you can see their annual reports and things like that, but private equity is very difficult to penetrate. We don't even know sometimes when a building is owned by Blackstone because what they tend to do is they incorporate locally and then they'll have a different name. I've started to be able to figure out the names. Like they have like a certain ring to them, so it's like, oh, that doesn't sound right. That sounds like private equity, and invariably it's true. But anyway, that's been the response. I mean, for the longest time, I was a bit of a lone wolf on this, especially from the human rights side. So I was small potatoes for them. I think they were a bit like, easy to get rid of her. I think things are a lot different now. I mean, you've had what's that commission here called? The Trade Commission did a huge review of Invitation Homes, one of the big players. Blackstone used to own Invitation Homes, and came out with a very strong investigation and report, and Invitation Homes ended up negotiating with the commission to pay millions back to tenants. So I think we're in a slightly different space now where people like me are more of a threat.
So based on your experience, do you think there's any possibility of business acting as a productive partner in this space, or do you think that basically the profit incentive just renders this impossible?
I think private equity is too predatory in nature, and their business model is so rooted in making profit over a short term using particular methodologies. I don't think there's room for negotiation there. I think they need to leave the space. As for other actors, there may be some room. I sat down in a admittedly it was a failed attempt, but I did sit down with the 5 largest REITs in Canada, many of which are multinational, of course, and had a discussion with them. They felt quite threatened by the noise that I was making, along with many other grassroots organizers. So they were willing to sit down with me. I'm known in Canada. I have a media voice, a profile, etc. But I mean, they still want to position themselves always as if they are the solution to the housing crisis. And unless and until they take on board that their methodologies are contrary to the standards and requirements under human rights law, I don't know where we're going to get with them. I'd like to see the strong hand of government. Now here, you just elected a real estate mogul. I mean, not you.
All right, thank you, Leilani. Michael, let's turn to your UN mandate. One of the key challenges in realizing the right to food has been corporate dominance in food systems and corporate capture of food governance. So, similar to Leilani, can you start for our audience by explaining the nature of the problem, who the main players in the agri-food sector are, and their size, their consolidation activity?
I do have to start by saying, because I'm still a UN Special Rapporteur, that I'm off duty. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. Please don't quote me. Please don't put things on social media about what I'm going to say. It does, as Leilani knows, it does carry a weight of authority. So when I speak in public, sometimes I want to be on the record. Today, this is an opportunity for me to think out loud. And before I answer Erin's question, I just want to thank the students for organizing this, because the issue of corporate power is such a problem in the food sector that my next report in 6 months is on corporate power. And this event is my first real, you all forced me to do my homework. So thank you. I'm 47 and I'm still falling behind on doing my homework. But it's an opportunity to think in this unique space. So to give you a sense of how I come at this question, actually I'm a little different than Leilani's. I'm not a human rights lawyer. I care about food and agriculture. I teach commercial law. I met Erin when I was a corporate lawyer. And my starting position is to understand food, you have to understand all the legal regimes. That's everything. Take any food item. It's private law, it's public law, it's national, it's international, it's everything. So when I teach food and agricultural law, the argument I make is if you change the food system, you change everything. So I come at it with this sort of pluralistic sensibility. By any means necessary, we will use whatever tools we need to fundamentally transform whatever needs to change. So that's where I'm coming from. To answer the question now, more specifically, corporate power operates in a lot of different ways and creating its own problems. So first, huge market concentration in the food sector. So for example, there's what we call the Big Four. This is Dow DuPont after they merged. This is Chem China, which had acquired Syngenta. This is Bayer, and this is BASF. It used to be the Big Six, but there was mergers and acquisitions, and they're now the Big Four. They control 60% of the seed market, seeds, and the same companies control 75% of the pesticide market. This is a problem for several reasons. One, seeds are the origin of life. Whoever controls seeds controls life itself. We are a plant-based planet. They control life itself, and in the United States, they can turn life into property. Second, why are seed companies the same as chemical companies? Why is BASF in the food industry? Because they're selling you seed actually as a mechanism for you to force you, these are particular types of seeds, that then you have to use their pesticide. So they're chemical companies selling us food. So that's in one sector. Global grain trade, 4 firms control 70 to 90% of global grain. If you block grain, you get immediate hunger. Similar to the housing market, financialization. So in 2008, 2009, there was a food crisis because the price of food had skyrocketed. It wasn't a supply-demand issue. It wasn't a lack of food. Hunger is never a lack of enough food. It was that the food sector had become so financialized that prices were reflecting financial markets and the demands of financial actors and not the needs of people who need to eat, or producers, people who make food, or workers, the people who also make our food. And that financialization created and continues to create huge volatility. So it's not just high prices, it's volatile prices. And finally, land, the concentration of land. A big part of any food system, of course, is land. The largest owner of agricultural land in the United States, the biggest farmer, is Bill Gates. Or rather, is it still Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Why are they owning agricultural land? They own the greatest amount. My intuition is, what I'm seeing with corporations is, more and more corporations are entering the food and agricultural sector, not just for all the reasons I described, but it's now a source of big data. So it's just how farmers farm is just a source of now data. So it's we're all turning into content, right? And so they're seeing food and agriculture as yet another space, so very similar to financialization. So all of this power in the hands of very few creates problems with price volatility. What kind of food are we being given? Who decides what we eat, when we eat? It's in the hands of a very small number of actors.
So when we look at that dominance then of corporate actors in global food systems, how do we understand, how do we juxtapose that with the current global food crisis?
So we're in a food crisis, and it got triggered in 2020 with the pandemic. So when the pandemic hit, immediately there was a hunger crisis in every single country in the world. And a lot of people, you would read so-called supply chain disruption, which is too abstract of a concept. Why did we have a food crisis with the pandemic? And when the pandemic formally ended, the rates of hunger and malnutrition increased because governments during the pandemic created temporary programs to deal with hunger, and they worked. Universal meals for school children, direct cash payments to family, connecting small food producers directly to consumers, etc. Rather than making them permanent programs to alleviate hunger, they stopped them while there's a global debt crisis and inflation's on the rise. What we learned from the pandemic is that the price of food skyrocketed and continues to skyrocket, and it didn't reflect, if you do the math, the rate of inflation did not reflect the disruption in supply. It reflected the power of the few and their ability to price it at whatever, using the crisis as an opportunity to justify inflated prices, one. Two, what's a supply chain disruption? It's workers getting sick and dying. So workers in the food and agricultural sector, people in the fields, people in supermarkets, were heralded as essential, but essential worker was treated as expendable. You have to go to work under any condition. And your choice is either get sick from the virus or lose your livelihood and go hungry. So essential workers were treated as expendable. That's what the supply chain disruption was. It was workers getting sick. So the pandemic reflected, there's no obvious reason why a virus created a hunger crisis, and it reflected that the pandemic took existing problems and made them worse. And where we are today now is I'm seeing more, and this is echoing what Leilani said, I'm seeing more and more corporate actors in the UN space influencing governance in quasi-public spaces because they present themselves as we feed the world, right? So they're now stepping out of the market sector and private sector, and they're acting like people who govern with no accountability.
So following from that, in your work, you and others working at this space, in analyzing the activity of global food corporations, you've characterized their activity as extractive in nature. And I'm interested in exploring a little bit about the subtle repercussions of extractive activity. How has that activity, for example, impacted people's ecological relationships? How has it changed? How has it altered, even at a subtle level, their overall relationship with food?
I'll answer. There's a preliminary point I'll make before I answer, which is to understand what causes hunger and malnutrition. And I'll add famine and starvation. It's never in modern history, so let's say the last 60 to 100 years, hunger, malnutrition, famine, starvation has never been caused because of a lack of enough food. There's no food available. Hunger and malnutrition and starvation is always caused by denial of access to food. It's always a problem of politics, institutions, and power. Someone has made a choice, or there is a design of denying some people access to food, leading to higher rates of hunger and malnutrition. So that's on the hunger malnutrition side. So the problem then, if we understand, a friend put it, that a lot of these companies don't sell food, they sell edible commodities. If you start thinking, you start to see, okay, the business model is even, it's some degree of economic growth. No matter how we're going to find value, where we put profit and principle, whatever it is, the business model is make money, and get people to consume more of your edible commodity. It's in a way, it's kind of old school. It's like a factory. You move from here and you create value and you sell the thing. But the way we eat is in relation to the land and to nature and to the water is circular. Some people use the language of regenerative that has its own baggage. Let's just use space. It's circular and it's relational. How you eat is your reflection of your relationship with the land. And so there is a way where we can eat food that increases biodiversity, where we eat food that makes you stronger and healthier. Right now we're being sold edible commodities that make us physically sick and our environment sick and our communities weaker and dependent, the dependency. So it's extraction, extracting value from labor, to use an old concept, extracting resources from the land, extracting wealth from communities, and it's dependency. It's creating then relationships of dependency of the majority of us are at the mercy of the few with no way of holding them accountable. But I'll add, I always struggle with accountability because if we're talking accountability, I worry it's too late. Because the question I always ask is, how did they get power in the first place? Before, you hold them accountable, we're just now a line item in the budget. Human rights shit disturber, $2 million this year, we can afford that. How did we allow corporations to gain power in the first place is why I'm here to learn from all of you. We have to get inside the corporation, corporate governance, private law tools, all the things we've been hearing about today. But I take a very different position than maybe others, is over the years, you're supposed to get more conservative as you get older. It's the opposite is happening. I'm in a burn it all down mode these days, just, to put it out there. And this is what I mean by that is, we don't need corporations to feed us. The pandemic proved that. Who fed us in the pandemic? We fed each other. It was mutual aid societies, it was neighbors, it was communities, it was people coming together, figuring shit out on their own, and feeding each other. And I saw this globally. So I'm the special rapporteur in the midst of a pandemic and a food crisis. I talk to everybody in the world. peasants, pastoralists, fishers, people in cities, people in the country, in every continent, in many countries. And I asked what worked. No one said the supermarket and corporate, the corporate food sector. So we don't need, and the corporatization of the food sector globally doesn't start until the 1970s, really. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon. So doing business, yes, as a commercial lawyer, I'll say, of course, do business. But why in the corporate form? Right? We have to, it's a privilege. A corporation has to justify its existence in the food sector. And if it crosses a line, eliminate it, kill the charter. Why does it get to live in perpetuity? If a real person does what a corporation does, there are consequences. So the corporation, before we get to accountability, before we get to whatever, limit its power from the front end. And I take a militant position, meaning I'm not here to compromise, I'm here to win. And my position to the corporation is, you've got too much power, I'm coming after you. Millions of people want to use the tools to reduce your power in the first place. And if you cross the line, we're going to execute you. I'm an abolitionist unless it comes to a corporation.
I'm internalizing all of that. Thinking about how to try to work that into my Bizorg course. Before I let go of the idea of extractive activity, can you say a little bit more about the relationship between extractive activity and land displacement, and then the relationship between that displacement and sort of forced movement into a situation of poverty?
So if we use the idea of extraction, meaning a lot of taking from here, profiting, just in the simplest form, and a drive for constant economic growth and profit. If you look, so trade gives you a good way of sense of how this works. So under the WTO, the idea is to increase trade as much as possible. There are some limits, but it doesn't seem to be working. And what trade law does is it creates an incentive, especially if you align it with national agricultural policies, like in the United States, to have large farms. So trade tells you, trade more. Okay, if I'm going to trade more, what's the best thing? Okay, I need to produce more. So it's creating incentives, subsidies, all these mechanisms, market-based mechanisms, to encourage me to have the largest farm possible. Then with the economies of scale and that sort of thing added on top of that. And so the existing system creates an incentive for me to buy as much land as possible for the purpose of export. Not producing food, but producing commodities to export. So I've got a liberal trade regime, which makes it easier for me. And then I've got national agricultural laws, which in effect subsidizes rich farms, right, large landowners. And it's a great business model. So I'm going to buy up as much land as possible and produce things for purposes of export, which is usually bad for biodiversity, bad in terms of using chemicals, not necessarily what people need to eat to be healthy or strong. I'm going to do things like canola, wheat, coffee, cocoa, commodities, not food as such. And so corporations are the ones that can afford, they buy up all this land. There's no territory on earth that a community does not claim some relationship with. So you're inevitably, when you're buying up land for the purpose of farmland, you're always displacing someone. You're pushing someone off. It's usually indigenous communities, it's usually peasant communities, and it's usually in the global south, and racialized in a particular way. Surprise, it's racist. And so when you combine all of that together, you start to see, if you track land acquisition, it tells you, you start to see where power is, and it's often quiet. So you're seeing in different countries. In Africa now, Chinese companies are buying up land, Saudi Arabia is buying up land. It always comes back to land, follow the money, but follow land, and it tells you the story.
Okay, so just if I'm picking up what you're laying down, international economic law, it favors corporate actors. That has a relationship in terms of land displacement and then poverty. Can you say a little bit more about how that favorable treatment impacts just farmers in the Global South?
In the world of the right to food and human rights, the language is land tenure. And there's been a push to recognize tenure rights more broadly, not property rights, right? Property and private property is one particular way we organize our lives together through land and space. But there are many other ways in which communities establish who gets to live here, who gets access, all the different ways we relate to the land. Often it's communal, it's not individualized in many cases. And there's a wide variety of land tenure systems. And what land tenure does is it gives people a sense of belonging and stability. So one argument in favor of private property is that it creates an incentive to invest in the land to make it more productive. This is a very old argument from at least the 18th century. But that's a very individualized understanding of existence and a very narrow understanding of one's relationship with land in the short term and the long term. You can have communal rules of tenure and whatever, and what it provides is people the stability they need to establish a long-term relationship with the land, to be stewards of the land, and to have a livelihood. They still need to sell stuff, right? That people want. So there's a push, the way to protect, so corporations come in and most people get their food from small food producers, and from informal markets. When a corporation comes in, buys up land or blocks access to land or pollutes the land or whatever, it's mostly affected our rural communities and people who produce the food. So you displace people off their land, you disrupt their food system, and now they need to buy food from somewhere. Lo and behold, it's going to be a corporation. So the corporation both knocks them off their land and then says, oh, by the way, I have a bag of chips for you to buy as food. So they create the problem and then come as the makers of the solution, much like Leilani said.
Okay, thank you so much. So we've spent our time so far diagnosing and analyzing problems of corporate power under the umbrella of right to housing, right to food. So I now would like to turn our attention, our discussion, to some possible solutions. And in doing so, I'd love to bring, the two of you into conversation with one another. What do you think about the strengths and the weaknesses of the international human rights system in addressing these problems that we've discussed? And in doing so, it would be great if you could chat a little bit and maybe explain for our audience two of the main gains in town, the Ruggie framework, as well as the current UN treaty initiative at the UN level on business and human rights.
Yeah, well, we really need to be in conversation about this, Michael and Aaron, because, the last 16 months have shaken most international human rights lawyers, and I would say many independent experts within the UN system, as to the efficacy of the international order and promises made through the UN system. And I tell you, it is, he's a mechanism. I was a mechanism. And it's pretty confronting to see how ineffective the strongest mechanisms can be within the UN system. UN special rapporteurs are one of the I would say, one of the strongest mechanisms within the system. And look at what has been allowed to unfold in the last 16 months. So if that's not a broken system, what is? then for me as an advocate, I have to ask, okay, but what does that mean to me as someone who has always used international law and the international system as a tool in my advocacy, a central plank in everything I've done, including becoming a mechanism myself? What does that mean to me? And the alternative, though, is more bleak, I think, to say, let's abandon human rights, let's abandon the system, and let's just, this is the wild, wild, wild West, and let's just go. That, to me, freaks me right out, because I think then we are all doomed. We are all doomed, especially those of us from disadvantaged, marginalized communities. So I'll just tell you, and I'll end just quickly, like just to say, so I run an international human rights organization. We focus on housing and human rights and climate and finance. And we had a strategic meeting a few weeks ago to say, okay, like what do we do? Like where are we in this world? And we actually took a decision to go back to the UN and use accountability mechanisms within the UN. And in particular, accountability mechanisms that are targeted at states, actually not the private actors. So using treaty monitoring bodies. These are bodies that monitor states' compliance with international treaties. We've decided to put our efforts back there and to just go back and keep pummeling. Does that mean I have faith in the system? I don't know. I will say this. Even if the system is completely broken and probably completely corrupt, human rights themselves, to me, are all we have, and we are lost without them. The system might be screwed and screwed up, etc., but the rights themselves are meaningful. That's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Leilani. Michael.
I start from a different place than Leilani. I wonder if we land in the same place. We'll find out. I don't know where I'm going. But my starting position has been that international law has always been part of the problem. So I come from a tradition called third world approaches to international law. And the way I experienced international law is it was created and continues to be used as a tool of colonization, occupation, domination, exploitation, etc. That's international law was created for that purpose. Not until the 1950s and 1960s is there room for resistance against colonial power within international law. That's relatively recent. And so from the 60s till now, sort of this tradition I come from is ambivalent to international law and to human rights. You know, the United States used human rights language. One can say maybe hypocritically, but I would argue within the boundaries of it used human rights language to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq. They're going to save the Iraqi women. They used human rights language to justify the bombing of Libya, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my starting point. The existing tools, there's two things in play right now. There's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And the way those work are, they're voluntary. And listen, if something is soft law or hard law or voluntary or mandatory, that tells me nothing in terms of is it good, is it bad, is it effective, is it not? It's just the form. And each form has its own dynamic. In the financial sector, non-binding principles are the rule of the day sometimes. It just depends on what we're talking about. So the fact that they're principles and not binding law is neither here nor there for me. What tells me that the guiding principles don't work, how old are they now, Aaron?
I think it was, what was the year? 2011.
So it's what?
About
14 years. The world's worse. So like in a quick back of the envelope calculation, they don't work. Corporate power is worse, there's more violence, there's more hunger. So the last 14 years, just looking at the world, it's not, I mean, that's a counterfactual. Would it have been worse without the guiding principles? The guiding principles in the end we haven't seen a significant change in corporate behavior. And it's the theory of change that they were built on, and John Ruggie was involved, and from the beginning he got criticized for this, and I think time has proven him wrong. The theory of change is if we change the internal culture and social norms within corporations and businesses, if we convince them that respecting human rights is important, and you can make that argument a lot of different ways, bottom line, good corporate culture, it's good for your reputation, whatever, it becomes this internalized social norm, and then just doing human rights in this respecting human rights sort of way will move them gradually to be better actors in society. But that just ignores all theories of power. It just ignores power as a dynamic. So that's the guiding principle. So I have no faith in them whatsoever. Whereas in the UN, they're still mentioned in this and that, but whatever. There's a treaty being negotiated. So you think, a treaty. Got it. Hard law. I came in like, really, people, a treaty on businesses and whatever? Like, how 19th century of you? A treaty. It's so antiquated. It's so slow. You finally negotiate a treaty that's watered down and filled with ambiguities that by the time you ratify the treaty and then you implement it, we'll all be long dead and the world will be, crispy bacon. So I was like, really a treaty? But I changed my mind. And I'll get to a theory of change and where to go. Because a lot of social movements and activist groups said, we're devoting a lot of time to this treaty process. And like in private conversation, I'm like, why? Why? Like, what a stupid idea. And this was the explanation that won the day, not the form. So who cares what the legal tool is, ultimately, truly? What matters is the relationships and coalitions built around the campaign. How does change happen? Change happens when we either change our existing relationships or create new relationships. There are new relationships, new coalitions, new popular mobilizations around the treaty. Those new relationships around the treaty is already a new source of power. That's what matters, is those new relationships, regardless of the actual outcome of the treaty. So then my advice to this coalition and to the growing coalitions that are pushing against corporations is don't just think in terms of human rights. Use all the tools available. Corporate law, antitrust law, criminal law, civil liability, and it's a tactical decision. So what is needed is an actual campaign, and the campaign can mobilize in two different ways. One, it can mobilize as a group of people affected by corporate power. The Ogoni people in the Niger Delta fighting against Shell. Indigenous people in Brazil fighting multinationals. The Palestinian people fighting for their human rights and liberation against corporations that are complicit in genocide and occupation. From a people's perspective, then, you can take that position and create a strategy against one multinational or a whole sector or whatever, but it's grounded in a people's self-determination, and they make the call, and the legal choice is tactical. Are we going to use criminal law or corporate law or human rights law or multiple things? And it has to be full on. So it's a campaign, so you're using multiple tools, and you control the meaning and the narrative of the campaign around the legal tools. Another way of doing it is pick a sector or pick a company. Let's go after Shell. Let's all sit down and coordinate and go after Shell using every legal tool possible. Organize, mobilize, and their reputations are so fragile. They're so fragile. So if you have criminal proceedings in domestic courts, international criminal proceedings at the international level against individuals, you have tort claims, you have human rights claims at the international level, you're creating meaning, you're highlighting what's going on, and you're putting pressure on them financially and in the public. So it comes down to organize, organize, organize.
Okay, thank you for those thoughts. So we have questions that have come in via Slido, and I invite audience members to continue to submit them. Leilani, let me start with a question for you. The question is, there's been growing anger towards both landlords and real estate companies, more people questioning what value, what benefit they add to society. So correspondingly, people have been looking for alternatives. and ways to push back. So we have, for example, the rise of tenants' unions here in Connecticut, the push for housing co-ops in major cities. What do you think the relationship should be between companies that supply housing and those who need it? And how do these new alternatives, how do these organizing efforts, how do they affect that dynamic for better or worse?
That wasn't 160 characters.
I got stymied by the character limit this morning, too.
Yeah.
I elaborated a little.
Yeah, so, oh my God, that's quite a big question. Tenants' unions are incredibly important, and I'm pleased to hear they're springing up in Connecticut. I'm seeing them springing up in a lot of different places. Tenants are way behind employees, right? Unions are pretty common, although being obliterated right, left, and center, but nevertheless they're common, and tenants' unions are less common. So they are super important. From a human rights point of view, they're necessary because they are this self-determination that Michael's talking about, right? They are the voice. There's a concept in human rights law of meaningful engagement that people should not have decisions made about their lives without them being able to affect those decisions, right? They should be part of decision making. So just to underscore that, I think that alternative tenure models are super important. Cooperative housing, community land trusts, all of that certainly challenges dominant thinking around housing, which, I mean, the culture that it surrounds housing is so entrenched, right? I mean, many of us will be, on the one hand, concerned about homelessness on the streets, and on the other, super happy when we've heard that the house that we bought is now worth double what we paid. Well, those are inconsistent positions. We have to start understanding that our economies, the way our economies are structured, is creating the homelessness. That's why you can have economic growth and an increase, 18% increase, wasn't it, in homelessness in this country. I mean, in any other context, we would be going, whoa, what, right? When we're addressing developing countries, we say, you should strive for more economic growth so you can lessen poverty and meet your sustainable development goals, right? Well, here in the United States and Canada, you can have economic growth and an increase in homelessness, and no one says a word. So, I mean, attacking that culture that's so entrenched here. I mean, you're sitting on a bus and you see a sign, invest in Airbnb. I mean, this is all part of a bigger system. What should the relationship be? Obviously, everything should be tenant-driven, people-driven, community-driven. It goes to what Michael was saying, rather than the way things are working now. We need governments to start listening to people. Well, that would be a big change. Governments are now beholden to the corporation. We know that. They're led by the corporation. These private equity firms have more money than some governments, and certainly more than local governments, for example. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but that's what I've got to say.
Oh, thank you for that. Michael, a question that, an audience question that's very of the moment. With the rise of the America First ideology and looming potential trade wars, can Americans be self-sufficient with food production, or will this dynamic of increased isolation from global supply chains lead to greater food-related hardship domestically?
Yeah, I think the U.S. can feed everyone who lives here in terms of land and resources. The two challenges then, it wouldn't be trade. I don't think if U.S. just says we're done with this whole trade business, it'd be, in terms of agronomy, theoretically, the United States can grow more than enough food for everyone who lives here. The challenge is, one, the way the Farm Bill works now is it subsidizes things that we really don't need to eat. Canola, soy, wheat, sugar. What it doesn't subsidize is fruits and vegetables, for example. So the way the subsidies work is not to create a food system, unfortunately. So that's one problem. And then the second is labor. This is an agricultural system that depends on undocumented workers, right? Your legal status determines the amount of value that your labor time is worth. That's what it comes down to. And so what's interesting is like under the Obama administration, they were kind of supportive of undocumented workers, but I kept thinking, well, it still allows for exploitation. You know, okay, we're not gonna kick them out and throw them in children in cages, though they did still, et cetera, but it still relies on their legal status determining, like with weak labor laws. Or now it's kick everyone out. The agricultural sector, every time Trump threatens to kick out undocumented workers, they push back and they fight back because they know. So I don't think trade, whatever, they'll shut down, raise tariffs and whatever will happen. It's the Farm Bill and labor laws and citizenship.
So we are at time. I am mindful of the fact that there are a number of questions. Please deprive these two of their break. Come up and absolutely ask your questions and deprive them of the right to rest. Michael and Leilani, thank you so much for this incredibly enriching discussion. We all really appreciate the opportunity to learn from you. Please join me in a round of applause.